Welcome to Blue Talks.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Blue Talks podcast. Here we are at St. Hugh's College and the University of Oxford, and I'm joined by Dr. Melissa Robinson-Winemiller. And today we are going to be talking about something that's dear to my heart as well as this topic of empathy, which she just happens to be an expert on. So I'm excited to kind of get into the heart of this, but why don't you take a couple minutes, Melissa, and let us know who you are and what you're all about, and then we'll get into the interview itself.
Yeah. So I was actually a musician for a long time. Classical musician, played French horn, was a professor, played in symphonies, and I had some severely unempathetic leadership that drove me out. And so when I left that profession, the thing is when you do something like that for so long, it's not just who you are, it's like every ounce of your being, because I had been involved in it from a very young age. So I started trying to figure out what had happened to go so wrong and was like, it's the empathy piece. There was no connection there at all. The whole system was just bankrupt. And I started kind of going down that line. And the farther I went, the more I really thought this is something we need systemically, societally, across the board. And I just kept going. So now I'm in the process of finishing up my doctorate in interdisciplinary leadership, and my whole dissertation is centered around leadership and empathy.
That's great.
And I do tend to target leaders just because they can affect the most people, both good and bad.
Mm-hmm. So how long did it take you to figure out that it was that lack of empathy? Because I'm just curious, because I feel like I've had a similar experience in my career.
You know, unfortunately, the more people I talk to, the more I find that a lot of us have had a similar situation. I actually spun my wheels for about 7 years.
It took a long time.
Yeah, but it took a long time to kind of get traction, to get out of where I was at, because I was very confused for a long time.
Yeah. I think there's some studies out there that when people leave or become disengaged in their job, it has a lot to do with their manager. And how inclusive is their manager? How empathetic are they? How much do they leverage the skills and strengths of their people? Do they even know about that?
Yes.
And you can learn about that through demonstrating empathy for your people.
Absolutely.
Interesting. So why dive deep and study empathy? Obviously, you've had an experience around it that fuels your passion, but why continue that formally and study empathy?
Because the farther I got into the research, the more I realized that it's so much more than what we think it is. I mean, we think about empathy as, you know, I feel what you feel.
Yeah.
And that is part of it, and that's a big part of it. But even more to the heart of it, it's about human connection. How do we connect with one another? Whether it's connecting with the heart or connecting with the mind, connecting with nature, connecting with ourselves. There's so many facets to it. So the more I get into it, the more I'm like, we could really help society, you know, businesses on a small scale, society on a larger scale, by getting this figured out.
Yep. I have to be devil's advocate for a moment because I study soft skills as well. And sometimes people will say, well, you're studying empathy. Isn't that, you know, what's the point in it? Why is that so important in the workplace and relationships? Who cares? So what would you say?
I would say that if you want to actually work with people, you should care a lot, because this is how we connect. And if you want to be able to connect with your emotional intelligence and your soft skills to actually be a profitable leader, then you need to start with the empathy, because that's where it begins.
Absolutely. I think the old, more historical ways of leadership, leading by the book, have kind of fallen to the wayside, and it's more about connecting and understanding, especially since the pandemic. It's kind of heightened. You have to know your people and check in with them mentally in an empathetic way in order to keep that engagement going, because they could just flat out leave you, go find a different job. But if they feel that connection with you, they're more likely to stay, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And especially now with some of the generational friction going on. There are whole generations that are like, we can find a different job.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
So keep them here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but isn't empathy already a part of emotional intelligence? And if it isn't, how do we relate it to
That's
EQ?
a fantastic question, because Daniel Goleman, in his book in 1996, had a collection of skills that he said fell into the soft skills category.
Yeah.
And he threw empathy into that bucket.
Mm-hmm.
But I really think you have to start with empathy. And the more I dig into this, the more I think he was on the right track. But you have to begin with the empathy to connect to the soft skills. I talk about it being like a big tool bag.
Yeah.
Your soft skills, your emotional intelligence skills. And you've got motivation, and you've got communication, and you've got hammers and saws and drills and everything. Well, if you don't use empathy to connect first, when you reach into that bag, you don't know if you're dragging out a bandsaw or a chisel.
It's true.
So you have to know.
That makes sense to me. So then again, what is empathy? Just saying I relate to you and, giving you a compliment on your jacket. Is that empathy? Or if you say start with empathy, what does that look like, sound like?
It can be. Mm-hmm. It's really about that human connection. And more than I feel what you're feeling, I see you, I understand you, and I want to be able to understand you better. Mm-hmm. It's, in a lot of ways, it's about getting away from the me and getting into the you. If my focus is you, then it's probably going to be at least some form of empathy. If the focus is me and what you can do for me, then that's not empathy.
No, and I think we can feel that even if we don't have a word for it. But empathy isn't yet in our mental vocabulary. We can feel it when someone's focusing on us versus just trying to get their own to-do list done through us, you know?
Absolutely.
There's definitely a difference there.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of begs the question, can empathy be taught, or are you just born with it or without it?
That Plato actually asked that question. So we've had this question out there a long time. Empathy as a human thing is biologically wired in us to some degree. Mm-hmm. Newborn infants will cry when another one is crying. And it's this emotional contagion so that, it spreads, and that's the beginning. It's like a proto-empathy. It's where it begins. So for the most part, we don't need to teach it. We just need to practice it. There are some people that don't have any at all. And no, we can't teach feeling empathy. We can teach cognitive empathy, how to recognize and respond to feelings. Mm-hmm. So even that question's kind of nuanced.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess, what about people that just don't have it or don't feel that they have it? I mean, are they just a lost cause?
Not necessarily. So if you're looking at it in terms of human behavior, at the end of the spectrum where there's zero empathy at all, we're talking about dark triad. So now you have the narcissists, the Machiavellians, the psychopaths, and the sociopaths. And if they just have it not at all, they can learn cognitive empathy. And in fact, many of them do, which is how they can get smart enough to get paroled early or get into leadership positions or that kind of thing. But the really interesting part of that is, even though we have the dark triad down here, we actually have a light triad that we never talk about. No empathy, lots of empathy. Completely me-centered, completely centered on humanity. So again, we're dealing with a full spectrum.
That is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So we think about the link between empathy and intuition too. And when you talk about the people up here on this high end, I mean, would there be a connection there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I think that if you're, so there's three things down here with Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Yeah. Up here, you're talking about Kantianism, which is not using people as just a means to an end, but as a means to themselves. Mm-hmm. Faith in humanity and humanism. Yeah. And I think that if you're more tapped into that humanity, your intuition is going to be smarter.
That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it can be taught cognitively if we choose to be open to be taught.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
For that dark triad that you're talking about here, is there the possibility that some sort of empathy switch could be turned on for them and they could move up that ladder?
They haven't found it so far, because especially when dealing with psychopaths, when they do the brain scans, sorry, it's eluding me,
Sure.
but where the brain lights up when certain thought patterns happen,
Yeah.
they'll show like horrifically graphic pictures. And whereas a normal person, those centers in the brain will light up, for them, the brain doesn't do anything.
Interesting.
So they think it's actually neurobiologically based.
So would that mean it's passed down through family lines and DNA as well?
Yes,
Yeah.
usually in the male genetic line.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I learn something new every day. I didn't know this. Okay. So if someone wants to develop empathy, where might be a good place for them to start?
So when I try to teach people to practice this, I usually have them start with self-empathy, because a lot of times, like I deal with leaders a lot. So you have these people that are highly motivated,
Yes.
Maslow's pyramid, highly self-actualized, really driven individuals. But because of that, they work themselves very hard
Yes.
and don't show self-empathy, which is why they have substance abuse. The families are falling apart. They don't take care of themselves.
Yeah.
They don't eat well. So by starting with the self-empathy and understanding how to take care of yourself, then you can learn how to show it to other people. Because empathy leads to compassion. If you feel empathy and it causes a feeling of discomfort, the action you take because of that is compassion.
Sure.
So if you can start to show self-empathy and show self-compassion,
Yeah.
now you can mirror it in how you treat other people.
Wow. Yeah. So are there different types of empathy? You just mentioned self-empathy. And then earlier on you said something about empathy for others and the focus on not me, but you.
Yeah.
So what are some other levels of empathy that we need to be aware of?
So there is self-empathy. There's what's called affective or emotional empathy, which is the I feel what you feel. Cognitive empathy, which is that I logically understand what you feel. I just don't necessarily feel it.
Yeah.
There's other kind like empathy for and with animals, empathy in nature, empathy that's situational, that maybe isn't person to person, but like when all the hurricanes came through Florida, the empathy went to the situation.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. There's 43 different kinds of empathy.
Oh, wow.
And they kind of fall into 8 broad categories. But yeah, it's a massive subject.
Yeah. So starting with the self-empathy would be the simplest, easiest way to go.
And the most effective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So for folks out there that might be listening, like what tips might you give them for how to develop empathy or even be open to learning more about empathy if maybe they have a mental block thinking it's more of a soft skill and not something I really have to learn?
Unfortunately, it's one of those things that isn't like learn empathy in 4 easy steps.
Right. Here's your masterclass on empathy.
Have at it. Yeah. So what I try to teach is more of a practice because it's not a performance, right?
Yeah.
It's something you do for the rest of your life. And I kind of teach this through what I call micro meditations in that, you've got these busy executives and they don't have time to sit and think and journal and stuff for hours every day.
Yeah.
So rather, as you go throughout your day, take 30 seconds after this meeting and think about it. How did I interact? How was this received? How did things go? Take 30 seconds after you have your one-on-one with your VPs. How did this go? What sort of interactions did I have? How could have I done this better? That sort of thing. And pay attention. The other thing I really suggest is that they get somebody that will tell them, this isn't working for you. You might want to try this.
Yeah.
And it can't be someone that they're paying. It can't be someone that's going to be like, oh, you're fantastic.
Right.
It really needs to be an accountability person that's actually going to tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear, or a coach, but make sure you get a good one that's going to be aligned with what you want. Or it doesn't even matter if it's a buddy, as long as they're going to tell you what you need to hear.
Yeah.
And if you have no one, you can spend the time journaling and then reading it and figuring it out. It's just that a lot of executives don't have that kind of time.
Or they feel like they don't have that kind of time. They feel like they don't have that kind of time.
Right.
But what is that? What is that piece of advice that kind of goes around there? Like if you feel like you don't have time to meditate, then you need to meditate twice as long.
Yes.
Sounds like the same might be true for reflecting on your empathy skills.
It is. It's really just a way of building self-awareness.
Yeah.
Because you have to know where you are and what you're doing before you can understand how that's affecting other people.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what we're talking about is how does your place in space and time affect entire organizations.
That's absolutely. Well, now that we're talking about organization and the time that we have left, I want to talk about like the outcomes for organizations if you have an empathetic leader in place versus a non-empathetic leader. Sounds like kind of like the same situation that both you and I lived through. So what are some of the organizational outcomes for empathetic teams of empathetic leaders?
So Ernst & Young, the Big Four consultancy firm, did a deep survey study in 2001 as a response to the Great Resignation. And it was on empathy specifically, and it was so seminal that they actually did another one last year.
Interesting.
So they looked at empathy in the workplace, they surveyed employees, they surveyed leaders, and what they figured out was that by actually having leadership that's empathic, so that the employees actually understood and appreciated it, you could raise profit by 84%.
Oh my gosh.
You could raise productivity by 87%, and you could raise innovation by 88%.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are hard numbers. The data is there that backs it up.
Yes. Yeah. So this isn't just creating a nicer workplace anymore. Like there are some hard results that can be achieved through just learning how to be more empathetic within your role, your day to day. And I would venture to say it doesn't just apply to how you're relating to people at work. These can be transferable skills for your personal relationships and your friendships outside of work too.
Absolutely. And that's what I tell them. You don't leave this in your desk when you go home.
Right.
It goes with you.
It goes with you. Yeah. And you become a more, maybe I'll just say it, a more evolved person to be able to connect with people, you know, no matter what the situation might be.
And I've been doing case studies on my own that mirror the same results.
Really? Interesting.
So smaller scale, larger scale, it seems to be pretty across the board.
And those people that you're doing your case studies, are those organizational leaders, individual, or a mix of both?
A little bit of both, because I'm actually finding that the super top leaders don't necessarily want to hear what I have to say because they've gotten to that position by doing what they're doing.
Yeah, why change?
Right.
Yeah.
So the people that I'm having the greatest impact with are middle managers.
Yeah.
Because they manage both up and down.
They're in the middle.
Yes. And they're going to be the ones that someday are going to be the top leaders. So I'm really finding a niche right there that really needs it. And I am more than happy to spread the word.
That's so awesome. Well, thank you for enlightening us around empathy. Any last words of wisdom that you'd like to share with us before we close out for today?
You know, I think just that empathy has gotten this reputation for being this soft, fluffy thing.
Yeah.
But when you actually do it, it takes a lot of courage. So if someone's just kind of entering into this to try and figure it out and they feel like it's taking courage and maybe a little more bravery than they had expected, they're on the right path.
Yeah.
So just keep going.
Yeah. That's how we grow and evolve, is through trying different things, stepping outside of our comfort zone, trying it on a little bit. And it's going to be messy at first, and then it'll become second nature. And then before you know it, it'll be just a part of your normal everyday actions.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And that's what we want, good habits.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you
it's
for
been a pleasure.
having me.
Yeah. And hope you all enjoyed this episode of our Blue Talks podcast, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.